Ron Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, once again, here we are, speaking slot number 7. I am reminded often, Mr. Speaker, how you do remind us, particularly in committee stage, how we should try to be introduce new material and not be repetitive. And it's always hard in a second reading speech when you really want to encapsulate the purpose, the cause, the aim of the bill and what happened and transpired in the select committee in your speech and make a valued contribution. But it's all pretty much been said, so I will try and touch on a couple of things. The first thing I want to say is that it's really quite astonishing for me to working in the Local Government and Environment Select Committee. We have a very collegial committee that gets on very well, and we're able to progress legislation through that committee in a very collegial manner. And as you can be seen in this piece of legislation, to have the Minister stand up and say he accepts 100% of the recommendations made by the Select Committee is a tribute in itself to the way in which the committee goes about doing its work. I guess I can only say, Mr. Speaker, that there are a couple of people in the National Party side of that Select Committee who probably, if they were on the front benches of the government today, behaving and working in the way in which they do in Select Committee, there might be far better relationships between the National Party and the New Zealand First Party. We'd probably get on a whole lot better and we'd probably see less of the rubbish that we're seeing recently in the House from some of the front bench members. So I'm looking forward to Scott Simpson becoming a minister and replacing Mr. Joyce. No, he will replace Mr. Brownlee, and I'm looking forward to Todd Mueller moving through and taking over from Mr. Joyce, who probably does need to be moved on and out to pasture. So I want to thank the National Party committee members for the way in which they've worked on this legislation, and for the whole of the committee, the Labor team as well, because it really does make life pretty simple. What can we say about this legislation that hasn't already been said? I do want to put on the record, sometimes when we're moving legislation through the House, and this piece of legislation is probably a good example because it's technical, it's small, it's brief, and it was easily managed. But we do sometimes forget where this all came from. And the points raised by the Labor Party here today about what was an idealistic drive towards deregulation, which I have to say started in the Labor era of government in the 1980s, when deregulation by Roger Douglas and all his Phil Goff, I think, was an associate minister of finance around those times. The mantra for deregulation still. He actually wrote to me when I was in the Middle East explaining to me why I had to pay tax as a contract officer in Oman, employed by the Sultan of Oman, a letter which I still have, actually.
And I think
but when we talk about the drive towards deregulation, it is that actually created the problems that are still being addressed. It is that drive that put enormous stress on families. And we heard the stories about marriage breakups, suicides, bankruptcies, and it's easy to forget that sort of thing at this point in time in the debate. And I want to put on the record again, New Zealand First is very aware of the trauma that was inflicted upon families who unsuspectingly bought these homes. And then to have these homes, to have ratepayers who had nothing to do with this problem at all, being forced to pay for the remedial work on these homes, 25% from local government. Interesting, Carterton had one leaky home. And this from a district council that is able to put through consents in 4 days. Not like Auckland, what are you talking, 4 years? 4 millenniums? 4 generations? 4 years? We don't know. Carterton, consents through in 4 days. 4 days. And one leaky home. It's interesting that in certain parts of the country, builders would not build houses in the way in which they were being built in Christchurch and Auckland and Wellington. But here we are, thanks to the bravery of a couple who went to the Supreme Court and forced the government's hand by winning their case in the Supreme Court. And for the minister, Nick Smith at the time, picking up the legislation, picking it up and realising that something had to be done for these 70 people, hence the legislation that he brought from the House. But interesting, is it not, that the comments that were repeated here in the House by the Labor Party about Nick Smith's response to the Labor government of the day when this issue was being worked through and the government was struggling as to how to compensate these people for the silly decisions of a former government. Mr Smith, as we're quite rightly reminded, telling the government just write the cheque. The same Mr Smith who ended up being sued by Osmos New Zealand for comments that he made as a Member of Parliament about timber saver. Now, it's all a matter of record and you can read it on stuff. But it's interesting that we have the Minister finally who was concerned, obviously, about the preservative techniques and wanting to sheet home the blame for the leaky homes, I guess, I'm not sure. But when, as a Member of Parliament, made a comment about a company which defamed them, which resulted in them taking him to court, and of course the taxpayer ended up providing some funds towards the defence. All back to leaky homes, though. All back to leaky homes. So the impact was not just small and focused around a few homes in New Zealand. It affected, as we heard from the Greens, tens of thousands of homeowners, and ironically, it actually, in a strange way, affected the Minister who brought this bill to the House personally, as he fought and spent around hundreds of thousands of dollars defending himself in the court and eventually settling out of court. A long, sordid story. The other part of that. Yeah, and yes, Parliamentary Services paid $209,000 towards Nick Smith's defence. Taxpayers' money. Taxpayers' money. So it's really interesting. A horrible set of decisions made right at the outset around deregulation. That member, I can't remember his name, but he's clearly a deregulation fan. He's chipping me, but a horrible set of decisions made by our government on deregulation led to, what are we talking now? 15, 20 years? 20 years? 20 years. Deaths, suicides, bankruptcies, marriage breakups, a Member of Parliament probably inadvertently saying the wrong thing, ending up getting sued, a couple of $100,000 of taxpayers' money, a lawsuit brought by a couple against the government in order to get treated fairly. And here we are today, finally, hopefully, passing the last piece of legislation that will see, in some way, some of the wrongs being redressed. 70 people who were not eligible up until this point in time, now made eligible, now being able to get to funding assistance, and hopefully, Mr Speaker, hopefully, a closing in what is a terrible chapter of New Zealand's history in an experiment on deregulation driven myopically by free marketeers who believe that the market will fix everything. Oh, how wrong we are.
Paul Foster-Bell.